We're looking at great Buddhist figures from the past, and particularly looking at how we could use their aspects of their approach to enrich our practice here and now. We're never going to be able to practice exactly as they did. It's not appropriate in our time, in our culture, to try and copy them exactly, but there are aspects of their approach to the Dharma which we could bring in and enrich our practice, inspire us, enrich our practice. And tonight, I want to tell you about an important early Japanese teacher called Kukai, because I think that his approach has a lot to offer us. I think there are aspects of his vision which are particularly appropriate for us in our culture. So Kukai in Japanese means literally sea sky, I'm told. And that's a very, very apt name for Kukai. For someone who, as we'll see, had a deep feeling for the natural world, a close connection with the natural world, and for whom the appreciation of beauty and the awesome mystery of the natural world is very much part of his approach to practice. Kukai, incidentally, is also known in Japan as Kobo Daishi, which Daishi means great teacher, and Kobo means apparently to spread the Dharma widely. So the great teacher who spread the Dharma widely. Kukai is the founder of a school called Shingon. So Shingon means literally true word, and that refers to mantra. So mantra is an important part of his school. It's a tantric, it's a Vajrayana school. As far as I know, the only Vajrayana school in Japan. And Kukai is one of the most popular and respected figures, Buddhist figures in Japan, not just for his spiritual teachings and his practice, but also for what we might call his worldly achievements. He had a huge impact on Japanese culture, and he was a leader who could get things done when others couldn't. Even when it came to mobilizing people for big civil engineering projects, as we'll see. So Kukai was born on Shikoku Island in the south of Japan in the year 774, according to the book I've got about it. 774, the Christian era. And he was born into one of the highest aristocratic clans in Japan. A family that had produced many famous generals, statesmen, poets, and scholars. And when he was 14, his brilliant mind made an impression on one of his uncles, a man who was himself a distinguished scholar and, in fact, tutor to the Crown Prince of Japan. So this uncle took him into his home to educate him, along with a whole circle of privileged pupils. And he learned Chinese, he learned history, he learned poetry, philosophy, and the Confucian classics. And then, when he was 17, he entered the highest educational institution in Japan, a college in the capital that existed to educate the sons of the aristocracy to fit them to become high government officials. So he was being groomed. He was being groomed as a high flyer to become one of the top members of the ruling class. But while Kukai was at the college, he also came across Buddhist texts. And these made a really deep impression on him. So one biography tells us that he felt that all the other things he was learning were only dregs left over from the men of old, which did him little benefit in this life and would do him no benefit after death. So he wasn't happy following this sort of worldly curriculum. And eventually he gave up his chance of a glittering career, a secure future, and he left the college. He left the college and took up the life of a wandering hermit, spending his time in the wilds, in the forests, in the mountains, begging for food. And during this time, he developed a really deep love of the natural world he was living among. And he was also exposed to ancient native ways of life in Japan. And he was exposed to the sort of local animistic nature worship of Shinto. I suppose the original Japanese religion, really, in which everything in nature is seen as being alive. So every tree, every grove, every rock, every river is seen as having its own indwelling spirit. So during this time of wandering, he developed this deep feeling and reverence for the natural world and this deep sense of the aliveness of everything. We don't know a lot of detail about his life for those few years, but we do know that he spent a lot of time meditating in the mountains and forests, and that he also went from temple to temple studying the Dharma. He became a monk, cutting off his hair, and he took the 10 precepts, the same 10 precepts that order members take today. But Kukai wasn't satisfied. He wasn't satisfied with the Dharma he came across. He felt that he wasn't getting the full truth, that he wasn't getting what he really needed. Then we're told that during one of his periods of secluded meditation, he prayed earnestly before an image of the Buddha for help to resolve his doubts and find the teaching he needed. And we're told that that night he had a dream. And in this dream, a man appeared before him and said, "The Mahavarochana Sutra is the doctrine you've been searching for, the Sutra of Mahavarochana, the discourse on the great illuminator." Okay, I need to read the Mahavarochana Sutra. So he set off in search of the Mahavarochana Sutra, which wasn't easy to find because it had only just recently been translated into Japanese. So maybe we can imagine him walking from monastery to monastery, asking all the time for the Mahavarochana Sutra, the Sutra on the Great Illuminator, which nobody had ever heard of. And then at last, he comes to a monastery where the librarian says, "Hey, you're in luck. We've just got a copy. One of our monks copied it while he was away visiting another monastery. Here it is." So here it is. He had it in his hands. Here was the answer. So he takes it to a quiet place, and with great excitement, he opens it, and he started to read it. He couldn't understand what on earth it was talking about, which isn't surprising if you've ever seen it, actually. It's not a straightforward document. It's not a straightforward document with some nice, clear teachings. It's more poetry and myth than a set of rational teachings. To begin to understand it, you need the guidance of a teacher, and you need oral instruction in the meditations that it's alluding to. So that must have been a huge disappointment. But Kukai was not someone to be put off easily. He'd heard that there was a school of Buddhism based on the Mahavarochana Sutra flourishing in China. In China, he would be able to find a teacher who could instruct him in what it was about. So the next time the government sent a delegation to China, when he was 30 years old, Kukai volunteered to go. So the Japanese government fairly regularly sent a small delegation, a small fleet of ships to China, which was at the time, as far as Japan was concerned, was the center of civilization. So they go to bring back civilization to Japan. But apparently, Japanese shipbuilding was so bad and their navigation was so hit and miss that these trips were really, really dangerous. So dangerous that whenever a trip was announced, the court officials were thrown into a panic that they might be selected to go. We're told that some of them ran away, and others had nervous breakdowns from the stress of the idea that they might have to go on this expedition. So nobody wanted to go, so maybe it's not surprising that Kukai managed to find a place. So he did. And 4 ships set out on the expedition. And almost immediately, they were hit by a storm. One ship sank, one returned to port with everybody going, yippee, and the other two were separated. And the ship Kukai was on board got terribly lost, so they spent a month wandering around the China Sea before eventually landing in a completely different part of China to the one they were aiming for. So when they got there, the local officials weren't expecting it, so they refused to let the people on board into China. And apparently it was some months before they managed to get word to someone higher up that it was okay, that they should be let in. But eventually, Kukai did get into China, and he began wandering from monastery to monastery, looking for someone who could explain this sutra of the great illuminator, the sutra of Mahavarochana. And eventually, he found the person he was looking for in the form of a certain Hui Kuo. And Hui Kuo was 60 years old, which was regarded as close to death. So he was desperately looking for someone to pass his teachings on to. And he recognized that in Kukai, he had found a gifted successor, someone who could continue his mission. And what's more than continue his mission, could take his style of teaching to a whole new country, reach a whole new population of people. So he adopted Kukai as his successor and taught him everything he knew, initiated him into all the meditations that he knew. And Kukai, for his whole life, felt a deep bond of gratitude to Hui Kuo. But when Hui Kuo died, he returned to Japan. He returned to Japan taking many texts and also painted mandalas and artworks with him. And this artwork was seen as just as important as the written teachings, or even more so, because it communicated the mythic, imaginal side of practice, which, not just the rational, which in Kukai's mind was just as important or even more important. So the type of practice that Kukai took back to Japan, based on a Mahavarochana Sutra, as you would expect, it was centered on the figure of Mahavarochana, the great illuminator. But in many ways, it wasn't that different from the practice that order members adopt today in Triratna. It involved taking the same 10 precepts that Triratna order members take. And Kukai put terrific emphasis on abiding by the precepts. Living by the precepts was the way that we align ourselves with Mahavarochana in his mind. We open ourselves up. We align our lives to Mahavarochana. So it involved ethics, same precepts as we take on. It involved chanting mantras and visualization practices. In meditation, it was not that different from the sadhana practice, different figures perhaps, but not that different from the sadhana practices that order members are given at ordination. And as well as that sort of meditation and periods of retreat and seclusion, it also involved altruistic activity in the world, which Kukai saw as the way we join in with the compassionate activity of Mahavarochana. He is active in the world, compassionate in the world. We can become part of that by our altruistic activity. And for Kukai, this very world was a sacred place. This very world was a sacred place. And Buddhist practice was about realizing that sacredness, not about vanishing into some other reality. And that combination of secluded meditation and engagement in the world is also, well, it's what Sangha actually recommended for most order members. Alternating periods of retreat with periods of altruistic activity. And Kukai himself very much exemplified that sort of rhythm between secluded retreat and activity in the world, engagement. He established the main center of his new school, Shingon, in a really secluded wilderness mountain area, Mount Koya. And he loved meditating in the silence of the woods. He loved meditating in nature. He loved being away from the hustle and hurly-burly. But he combined this with periods of vigorous involvement in the world. So he spent lots of time in the capital. At one time, he was the main administrative officer for a whole region. He's often credited with inventing the Japanese syllabic alphabet. They have a syllabic alphabet as well as Chinese start ideograms. He was a celebrated artist and calligrapher and poet. And he was even an accomplished civil engineer, or at least he managed to get other people to be accomplished civil engineers. So in his native province, there was a reservoir that was essential for the farmers' irrigation, in which the dam had burst, causing a lot of misery, a lot of hardship, a lot of starvation. And the imperial court appointed a director to take charge of repairing this dam. But he found that he just couldn't do it. The reservoir was too big and nobody was willing to work on it. There were far too few willing workers. So in desperation, the governor of the province sent a letter to the emperor asking them to appoint Kukai to repair the dam. And this is what he says in his letter about Kukai. He says, religious people and ordinary folk alike are delighted to receive his good influence. If he stays, a crowd of people assemble around him. If he goes, a multitude follows him. Farmers long for him as they do for their children. If people hear that the master is coming, they will run out to welcome him. I sincerely request that he be appointed director. So he was. And he managed to mobilize the people to repair the dam, which is apparently still there to this day, although it's been a bit patched up at times. So with his emphasis on the 10 precepts and his emphasis on altruistic activity combined with meditation involving mantra and visualization, the style of practice he taught was not so different. But of course, the really distinctive thing about his school was this emphasis on Mahavarochana, the great illuminator. So for Kukai, the great illuminator, Mahavarochana, is constantly trying to get through to us in a variety of ways, constantly trying to help us grow beyond our cramped focus on our own little self to become something larger and more expansive. For Kukai, there is something built in to the very nature of the universe, the very nature of reality that is trying to get through to us. You could call this something, anything you like. Shinran, who you've already heard about, called it Amida, the infinite. Other traditions talk about the Adi Buddha, the primordial Buddha. For example, Samantabhadra. The founder of Triratna, Sangha, talks about the suprapersonal force. And he also talks about the bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, as a volition towards enlightenment that's inherent, built into the universe, and that we can open ourselves up to. So Kukai called this something the great illuminator, Mahavarochana. But of course, Mahavarochana is not a something. Mahavarochana is a someone. He has attributes of personality. And that's going to ring alarm bells for some people. But Sangha has pointed out that persons, beings like us, are the highest category of existence that we know. If we make the great illuminator or whatever a thing, something impersonal, we make it lower than a person, lower than us. Whereas in fact, in some ways it is like a person, but at a much higher level. It's suprapersonal rather than subpersonal. The great illuminer has attributes of personality, according to Kukai, like compassion and volition. And as I said, I could hear alarm bells going off all over the place and people thinking, he's talking about God. But Varochana or whatever we call whatever, is nothing like the God of the monotheistic religions. And looking at the world this way only becomes a problem if we lapse into literalism and make what is meant to be a mythic way of looking at the world into some sort of philosophy, some sort of metaphysical. And dogma, make it into a dogma. In Buddhism, we always try to remember that truth cannot be pinned, the truth about the real nature of things cannot be pinned down in words and ideas. And what's really important is this a helpful way of looking at things? Is this a helpful way of engaging? And I think it can be. Anyway, for Kukai, Mahavarochana, the great illuminator, is always constantly trying to shine some light into our darkness, the darkness of our minds, in a whole variety of ways. So one way he does this is to speak directly into our hearts and minds, if we're open to it, through what is called adhisthana. So adhisthana is sometimes translated as grace, but that doesn't really capture it. It's got too many sort of Christian connotations. In Kukai's tradition, this adhisthana, he called this adhisthana ka-ji, 2 syllables. Ka, K-A, Ji, J-I, ka-ji. And in one of his writings, he says that ka, the first part of the word, is the compassion of the enlightened mind. These are his words, pouring forth on the heart of sentient beings like the rays of the sun on water. Ka, the compassion of the Buddha. And ji, the second part of the word, is our Shraddha, what we call Shraddha, which allows us to receive the warmth and light of the rays and absorb them, as water can absorb the light and warmth of the sun. That's how he describes it. So this word Shraddha, if you like, our part of the bargain, what we have to do, is usually translated as faith. But again, that's a bit misleading. Doesn't mean believing in something that's ridiculous. Shraddha is our intuitive response to what is highest in the universe. Sangha actually describes it as the response of what is ultimate in us to what is ultimate in the universe. I think of it as like a thread that connects us to something and pulls us towards it. It's a sort of sense of felt sense of direction in life. It's the reason we're all here tonight. That's intuitive sense of something, and but the reason that we have it, the reason that we have that Shraddha and can be open to the influence of the great illuminator, is that we all have a bit of Mahavarochana within us too. So like speaks to like. So that is one of the ways that the great illuminator seeks to light up our minds directly by speaking to us through his adhisthana, his kaji. He also tries to get through to us by the words and ideas of the Dharma, communicated to us by teachers who are themselves part of the activity of Mahavarochana. He expresses himself through mantra, which for Kukai directly communicates aspects of the enlightened mind in a way that is deeper and truer than mere words and ideas. It communicates a whole universe when we chant a mantra. Something real about mantra, it's not just words. And he communicates through archetypal figures like bodhisattvas that we can meditate on. So when we meditate, it's as though Mahavarochana can take any form he jolly well likes in our minds and speak to us. But he can speak to us through these figures. He manifests himself through figures seen in meditation. And he also communicates through the natural world. So in one of his writings, he said the trees, the hills, and the stars are the pages of a sutra, revealing the truth about the nature of things. So this whole world is a sutra. This whole world is a spiritual teaching, he's saying. Mahavarochana, as I said, for Kukai, represents something that's built in to the very structure of the universe. And so that something shines out through that universe, shines out through the beauty of that universe, especially through the natural world and through art and craft, which a distinction is arbitrary. Through art and craft, when the artist is responding to something higher and not just trying to be clever. So for me, I remember one of the things that really got me, I was always interested in Buddhism from an early age, but one of the things that really struck me was going to an exhibition of Japanese ceramics. And I was entranced by this exhibition of Japanese ceramics. It just spoke to me of something, that's something. Just like, okay, wow. It was like almost a meditative experience going around the way, I don't know, well, if I could explain it, it wouldn't need to be done in ceramics, would it? But the ceramics communicated something that just made me think, wow, yeah, I really want to meditate, actually. So Mahavajrana is built into the very structure of the universe and shines through that universe, the beauty of the natural world, and through art and craft, when the artist is responding to something. So for Kukai, the sense of beauty and awe and wonder and spaciousness that we can experience in the natural world is telling us something about the nature of reality. It's telling us something about the nature of the reality that we are also part of. And it's speaking to us more directly and more deeply and more powerfully than any teaching that can be expressed in words and concepts. And this aspect of Kukai's approach to the Dharma is just so different. It's very, very different from that of the Theravada school of Southeast Asia, which some people regard as, well, they're the bee's knees, they're the true, original, whatever. But in the Theravada school of Southeast Asia, the world is seen as a place of ugliness that we need to escape from. And any sense of beauty we have is just us being sort of trapped by this horrible place. Not a style of, so according to this, sort of moving towards insight would involve moving towards seeing how ugly everything is, which is not really my experience, I have to say. It's axiomatic in Buddhism that we see most clearly when we're in the best state, when we've been meditating, when we're calm, when we're content, when our mind is full of positive emotion. That's when we see clearly. And for me, and I think everybody I know, that's when I see most beauty, not most ugliness. So this idea that somehow seeing ugliness is somehow a spiritual practice, I can't get my head around, saying it's totally perverse to me. And at a retreat on the subject of beauty in the spiritual life a few years ago that I was at, a very senior order member actually had the courage to say that the Theravada had got it wrong. They got it wrong. They had misunderstood the Buddha. They misunderstood what the Buddha was saying. And I just think that must be so. It must be so that when we're in our best state, when we're seeing most clearly, we see the world as beautiful. And that's when we're closest to insight. Insight involves seeing the world as beautiful. It involves an appreciative attention to the world, not seeing it as ugly. And for me, and for Kukai, seeing the beauty and sacredness of the world is in fact part of seeing the world as it is. It's part of insight. And for me, I just personally, the experience of beauty in a natural world has always been part of my sense of there being a spiritual reality and sense of being a spiritual quest. Speaking personally, I can relate to Kukai's teaching because I think I need to see the appreciation of beauty as a central part of my spiritual practice. I think I'm safe in saying that, according to Sangha, the faculty by which we experience beauty is the same faculty which allows us to experience spiritual truth. It's the faculty that, it's our ji in kaji, it's our shraddha, it's the same faculty that experiences that responds to something beautiful and higher, that responds to, say, beauty in nature. It's the same faculty. And we need to nurture that faculty if we want to make progress. It's the ji in kaji that makes us responsive to the light of the great illuminator. And sure, there's plenty of ugliness and brutality in the world and in the natural world, but to focus on that seems perverse when so much of our experience, we step out the door, into the garden, into nature, so much of our experience is of beauty. Why would we want to focus on the bad bits? That's me. But I think what I say applies to a lot of Buddhists in our culture, actually. I think the appreciation of the natural world is very much part of our culture. And it's also very much part of Japanese culture. It's not true of every culture. You don't seem to find it that much in Indian Buddhism, for example. But it's very much part of our culture. It's very much part of Japanese culture. There's something the two cultures have in common, very much in common. And I think that's the reason that some of the Japanese styles of practice seem quite attractive to us, because they also involve this sense of beauty in nature. But of course, our present day culture tends to see beauty, excessively, shallowly rational culture, tends to see beauty as just a cultural invention. So we're told mountains weren't seen as beautiful until the Romantic poets came along and said they were beautiful. And then everybody thought, mountains are supposed to be beautiful, so I now appreciate them. I think that's utter nonsense, personally. It's like there's no such thing as beauty out there. It's not a property of the world. It's just something we've invented, and we just go along with sort of cultural expectations about what it is. So the world is seen as just dead matter. The world around us is just dead. It's just matter. It's a machine. But that wasn't so for Kukai. That wasn't the way Kukai saw it. For him, the world around us was alive and sacred. And most of us, we've been educated, I certainly have, I've been at scientific education, educated to be a materialist, in the sense that to think that the material world is the real thing and anything else is just flim-flam, nothing. That's materialism as a philosophy. And I've been educated to be a materialist, to see the world of matter as dead, a sort of dead machine. But according to our founder, according to Sangha, he says, I quote, "A world conceived of as dead is not a world in which there is any chance of becoming enlightened." So, okay, I have to re-educate myself if I want to move anywhere towards enlightenment. We have to re-educate ourselves if we've been infected with that way of looking at things, which I think most of us have. So to live in full color, we need to bring the world alive. We need to make the ordinary sacred. We need to see that even what we call the inanimate world is part of our miraculous, living, meaningful reality. To live a meaningful spiritual life, we need to see ourselves as part of a living universe in which beauty and spiritual values are built in. In Kukai's terms, we could say that we need to see all things as expressing Mahavarochana, if you like. Those would be his terms. Perhaps we should even open up to seeing the world as the people of Shinto do, seeing the world as full of what we might call spirits, like the spirit of place we can experience in certain places. I don't know about you, but sometimes, particular places have got a really, really definite feel. A lot of my family come from East Anglia. I go to East Anglia. It has a definite feel about it. Particular places have a definite feel. Sheffield, the Peak District, quite different. There are groves of trees that just make me want to go, whoa, there's something going on here. I remember when we, at Gukuloka, we had various sort of things that were part of rituals. I shouldn't say that, should I? Probably. Anyway, we had various things that were part of rituals that we were told to take back and bury somewhere that was sort of holy to us. And there's a particular grove of trees. I can actually see it from my house. I buried this stuff, and it's still got power. It's got power. So maybe we should open up to seeing the world more magically. Having been educated as a materialist nihilist, I consciously try to see the world more magically. And I think that's a really good thing. So what can we take away? I mean, that's one thing we could take away. What can we, trying to sort of pin it down a bit more, what can we take away from Kukai's approach that we could use to enrich our practice? And I think for one thing, we could cultivate our ability to experience beauty in all its forms. Really cultivate it. The faculty by which we experience beauty is connected to the faculty by which we connect to something higher, our Shraddha. The more we strengthen it, the more we strengthen our experience of beauty, our faculty for experiencing beauty, the more we strengthen our connection to the enlightened mind. So we should nurture our capacity to experience beauty. How do we do that? Give it time and give it opportunity. Pay more attention to the real world. Spend more time in the real world, and less time in the unreal world of mental proliferation, prapancha, that comes to us through our phones and our screens. All too many people in our society live in that totally unreal world. Prapancha, mental proliferation. Pay attention to the real world. Walk into work, how about taking out the earphones, not speaking on the phone, and looking and experiencing? Because if we don't do that, we're just in a phony sort of human-created world. So, as part of the same process, we could learn to see the wonder and reverence we experience in the natural world as a communication from reality. That's telling us something important about the universe and our place in it. We could be open to the feeling of reverence that we can get in the natural world or in contact with great art. Just open to that feeling of reverence. There's a Pali Sutta, the Gaurava Sutta, the Sutra on Reverence, where the Buddha tells us, I think this is a pretty straight quote from the Pali, a person without reverence lives unhappily. A person without reverence lives unhappily. But so many people in our society live without reverence. We've been taught not to experience reverence. But to live happily, let alone to follow the spiritual path, be open to Mahavarochana, we need to rediscover our capacity for reverence. And for many of us, by far the easiest way to do this is through our experience of the natural world, which can give us awe and a sense of mystery, make us realize our smallness and the wonder and vastness of the universe that we're part of. So I think that's one way that we can open up more to reverence. And I'm reminded about that. We had a retreat years and years ago at Lockabrook up in the Peak District, which was a retreat on reverence. And I suggested that as part of this retreat, people might take up as a practice bowing to anything in nature that they felt gave them that feeling of reverence. So I went out one dawn, and it was a beautiful dawn, and there was this lovely, scene with the lady the Derwent reservoirs down there, and wonderful sunrise, and there's people standing out there going. So I think we should just express it, learn to express it, be okay about expressing reverence. Yeah, just express it. It's not, we think of it as something terrible. So, I remember the first time I bowed in a puja. It's like, oh my God, we don't do that sort of thing, do we? But I think we could learn to, and I think that would be a serious part of opening up a faculty, which is what connects us to something beyond ourselves. The ability to perceive something as beyond ourselves and have reverence for it. It's metta for something higher than us. That's what it is. So we could learn from Kukai by recognizing and cultivating our faculty of reverence, expressing it. Try bowing to a tree or a sunset. We could allow reverence and a sense of the world as a sacred place to spill over into the way we live our lives. And in this way, we will open ourselves up to the enlightening influence of the great illuminator. Okay. Suggestions.